To redo the previous episode, Kirk was kind enough to give me some time to redo this episode because previously technology let me down and the recorded file for the episode actually ended up cropped after 20 minutes. So I've updated, the software. So hopefully that doesn't happen again. Again, for each episode of the interviews and discussions that I have, first of all, I ask two questions. So please give us some sort of personal background, how you became interested in philosophy, especially philosophy of religion, the type of work you do in philosophy, and, just get as personal as you like, because I would love to know the personal background and how it figures into your interests.
Yeah, I started university later than most. I wasn't academically inclined in high school. So I started university when I was 20, and I was a religious studies major, so I had a lot of, quasi-philosophical questions that maybe at the time I thought were going to be answered in religious studies. And I soon realized that after taking a philosophy course, an introduction, I realized that these questions were actually, the questions I was most interested in were being explored in philosophy courses. So I transferred majors. I've really been doing philosophy ever since. After that, I did an MA in humanities with a focus in philosophy. I actually wrote a thesis on the problem of no best world. So William Rowe's book, Can God Be Free, was kind of the launching point for that thesis. I then did another MA at Ryerson University where I worked with Class Gray. And I actually wrote on religious disagreement under class, but he was also working on this topic called the Axiology of theism, and that's how I got interested in the Axiology of theism. So Class Gray had a grant from Templeton when I was at Ryerson, and I did my PhD at McMaster on the epistemology of disagreement, so I was really interested in this topic, but there were also professional considerations for the job market. It's good if you can diversify your ALS. Philosophy of religion is not overly popular, so I wanted to write on something not in philosophy of religion. But I always was interested in this topic. I had written a few things, and so after I finished my dissertation, I sort of started working on the book. And so I think there was a time where I was interested in the existential questions about God. So existence questions. Does God exist? Is it rational to think God exists? But I think there's been so much written on some of the arguments. I wasn't necessarily sure what I was really going to add to those debates. And I got really interested in the axiological question, which asks, does God's existence matter, or what, if any, is God's value impact on the world? So that's what I've been working on. And recently I've been working on sort of applying ideas in African ethics to this debate. That's where I'm at these days.
So with that, let's jump into the axiology. So our discussion today, I think, would be mostly focused on the two initial books. that you had on the topic. One is the Axiology of Theism and Other Worldviews, and also an anthology that explored 4 views of different people on the same topic. But let's start first of all with, you already mentioned a few details about it. What is the axiological question and how this whole thing started out? Because it's a literature that is developing recently, an exciting new literature, I might add.
Yeah, so there's actually, I can't remember the citation, it's early 90s, but Nicholas Brecher actually makes sort of a passing comment about the value of God's existence. But I don't think the literature really ticked off or people kind of noticed until Guy Kahane's 2011 paper. So it was this paper that was discussing, should we want God's exist? Should we want God to exist? Is God's existence a good thing? And Kahane sort of, maybe not, it's not fully developed, but gestures at the idea that at least for certain individuals, they would be rational to prefer that God not exist. And I think for many people, not just theists, this was quite a striking conclusion, because I think lots of people, even if they don't believe that God exists or aren't sure that God exists, would think, well, yeah, it would be a good thing if God exists. So I think this was a striking conclusion, and since then it's generated, I wouldn't say tons of literature, but it's the axiology of theism has now become, I think, a legitimate subdiscipline in the philosophy of religion. I have a monograph. Klaus Kray's also about to publish a short book on it that will be coming out soon. So there's starting to be...
Yeah, there certainly is a growth in the interest on axiology. More and more people are figuring it into their own ideas and views. Now, at the outset of the book, you give a summary of different positions that one could have when it comes to the axiology question. So just walk us through different, positions that you could hold with regard to the axiological question.
Yeah, so I think there are at least, I'll start with sort of general positions. So what's come to be known as pro-theism is the view that God's existence adds value to the world or is positive. And anti-theism is the view that God's existence detracts from the value of the world. There are also 3 other positions that have been less discussed in the literature, although I think they're deserving of more attention down the road. So quietism has been identified as the view that the axiological question about God is somehow in principle unanswerable. Neutralism is the view that God's existence isn't good or bad. It's neutral, the neutral impact on the world. And then there's also agnosticism. You might think, well, maybe this question is in principle answerable, but we're just not in a good position to answer it now. So most of the debate has been between anti-theists and pro-theists, and I think within that discussion, there are also important kind of subdivisions. So you could think God's existence is good for persons, right, or not good for persons. So you could make judgment about God's value impact on persons. So these are personal judgments. You could also make judgments about God's impact not having to do with persons. Maybe you think, so one example of this, if God is infinitely valuable, maybe God's existence just adds infinite value to every world. So that's kind of an impersonal judgment. And then the final distinction is between, it's called wide and narrow scope. So narrow has kind of been used to identify value impacts in certain respects, right? So maybe God's existence makes the world worse for certain persons in certain respects, but that's distinct from an overall judgment or a wide judgment, which says that God's existence is better or worse overall. So despite on the surface, the anti-theist and pro-theist being in tension with one another, there are actually different ways you can hold both of these views, right? So you could be a personal anti-theist in thinking God's existence, personal narrow anti-theist in thinking God's existence makes things worse in certain respects, but a wide pro-theist who thinks, it's still better overall that God exists. So there's kind of crossover there, but those are the general positions that have kind of been staked out thus far.
One worry that you mentioned just before getting into the whole assessment of axiological question is the necessity of God and how it could, keep us from exploring the axiological question. So how do you, and you offer, different ways to resolve this worry, 6 different ways to resolve this worry. So what is the initial worry there?
Yeah, so I don't want to get into too much technical detail, but the general worry is this. So many theists say, look, God is a necessary being, and by that they mean that God exists in every possible world or every possible state of affairs. So you can't really make comparative judgments across different worlds where God exists and God doesn't exist. Why? Because God exists in every world. So there's this initial worry that maybe axiological questions can't even be sensibly asked.
Also, we will come back to this. It's not only theists. So, for example, Graham Oppy is actually among these people. And yes, so we will come back to this. But, okay, so walk us through the suggestions you have, to kind of overcome this worry.
Yeah, so I think, I won't walk through them all, but I think so. So this worry assumes something called, Lewis Stallnacker semantics, and I won't get into the technical details, but you could deny the semantics, right? So there's a certain understanding of possible world semantics that you have to assume to get this objection off the ground, and so one way is to deny it. Another thing I don't necessarily talk that much about in the book, but which I think people should really consider is that the axiology of theism gets picked on unfairly with this objection because these sorts of comparative judgments are actually made in other debates in philosophy of religion, and no one says anything about it. So in the problem of evil, we're making these comparisons all the time. I mean, the atheist who raises the problem of evil is saying that, no, a world with God would be better because there would be less or no evil or different types of evil. And Pascal's wager, right, is making these sort of comparative judgments. Which would you prefer, right? Would it be better to have a world with God and go to heaven, or be wrong and end up in hell? So it's a comparative judgment. My own preferred solution is to say, look, even if you want to say God exists in every possible world and this is a problem for making comparative judgments, that's about metaphysical possibility or what exists, right? And so there's something called epistemic possibility. David Chalmers does a nice paper on it. And this just says, for all we know, right, such and such might be the case. So if a theist isn't certain, if they're not epistemically certain that God exists, if they think it's at least slightly possible that God doesn't exist, they can say, well, for all we know, there's this world where God doesn't exist. So we're just comparing epistemic possibilities. For all we know, God might exist. For all we know, God might not exist. So you don't have to worry about the necessity condition here. So that's kind of my preferred solution.
it also seems to me to be also, not useful in dialectical context. It is kind of similar to accusations of question begging nature of, the dialectic. First of all, I don't think that's a useful go about it. And another thing is that hypotheticals are used all the time, and it's just not about, even philosophy of religion. There are other areas of philosophy that we do the same thing, that we have the same kind of reaction that we have to Pascal's wager or the problem of evil, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
But the thing is, axiological considerations depend on some sort of value or ethical disagreement. So, and you go through the fact that they could be problematic, but you offer intersubjective agreement. So how would you use that to resolve this problem?
Yeah, I've actually come to maybe doubt what I say in this section. So I think what I say is, look, so one worry might be, well, a theist, and even within theism, there's divine command theory, natural law theory, and other more nuanced positions. There are other ethical theories, utilitarianism, deontology, etc. Why not think that these are going to all issue different judgments, right, about the axiology of theism? So why not think that if you disagree about what sort of underlying meta-ethical theory is supporting your judgments, that there's going to be disagreement about the axiological judgments about God, right? So don't you have to agree at both levels? And I sort of argue there that, you don't necessarily have to have that kind of agreement at the meta-ethical level, because a lot of judgments that these theories issue are actually similar. We think they're dissimilar because we talk about the controversial cases and we focus on the areas in which they disagree, right? But I've since come to question how much intersubjective agreement there actually is. But having said that, I think in as much as you agree with sort of the general values that I'm discussing in the book, and as much as you think the things I think are goods, then there's enough agreement for us to have something to talk about at least.
This seems to me to be, this is rather similar for the problem of evil again and skeptical theism. Even in those cases, there are relative agreements on different specific things that we use for our discussion and assessment. So I think that's relatively similar. So let's get into the starting point. And you start in the book with the meaningful life argument. So walk us through that, and how is that relevant to the axiological question?
Yeah, so the meaningful life argument is kind of one of the first ones. Guy Kahane kind of gestures at it, Myron Penner develops it, but the basic idea is that at least for certain individuals, their life's projects, their life's work, the things that give their life meaning would in fact become meaningless if it turned out God existed. And as such, at least for those individuals, it's rational for them to prefer that God not exist, or think that a world with God is worse than a world without God. And so, in the rest of, not the rest of the book, but what follows, I try to tease out what some of those goods might be in kind of separate arguments.
It seems to me that the most problematic part, at least to my mind, is when we want to figure in a skeptical theism. So briefly, what do you think about that? Because in your anthology, I think, Perry Hendricks touches on this. So what are your thoughts,
Yeah, I haven't thought about too much how skeptical theism interacts with this debate. So personally, I think skeptical theism is false, and I'm actually sort of shocked that so many people endorse skeptical theism, and so many really smart people who are way smarter than me endorse skeptical theism. So I don't know, I don't understand why there's a big literature on it, but that aside, I mean, skeptical theists, they're not denying that there is evil in the world, right? They're just denying that we're in a good epistemic position to identify certain facts about that evil, namely whether or not God might have had a sufficient reason for permitting it, or maybe we're not in a good epistemic position to identify whether an instance of evil is in fact gratuitous. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know if you could make similar moves about the goods I mentioned. I don't see how you could. So it's not as if the skeptical theist is saying, that instance of evil is not in fact an evil. It's just they're saying we should be skeptical about certain things we can say about that evil.
And it seems to me like, I'm not asserting that a skeptical theism, a skeptical theist should be in moral paralysis, but I think I find this really problematic. So the flip side of it could work too, right? So for example, there are goods that theists consider to be good. So the anti-theist could rely on those goods that the theist affirms as good, and then maybe they would love to see more or less of those, and in that sense the goods identified or the reduction of those things are not things that the skeptical theist would be threatened by skeptical theism. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, so there's been a lot in the literature. I don't follow it that closely, but I know there's been a lot in the literature made of, okay, does the type of skepticism the skeptical theist is appealing to, does it apply to other areas? Because they really don't want it to, right? They really want it to be focused on these sorts of evils and what we can say about them. So there is this question, is this a skeptical sword that actually cuts in a lot of different directions, right? So does this sort of skepticism entail different type of epistemic skepticism, different type of moral skepticism? I tend to think it does, although there are lots of papers in the literature arguing to the contrary, but I do think this is a worry that's out there. Is there a principled reason to delineate the type of skepticism in play from turning into a more global problem?
Let's bring this back to the meaningful life argument. I've never asked you this, so do you think that the meaningful life argument is successful, or I'm not in some sort of narrow personal way, but do you think is there a successful formulation of it that is that would be wide, impersonal, and plausible to your mind?
Yeah, I think I'm more skeptical of the meaningful life argument being able to establish a wide version of personal anti-theism. I think theism is so interwoven into the meaning of life for so many people that you'd have to say so many people are wrong about what in fact makes their lives meaningful. But I do think there is a tendency for some theists, maybe not in the philosophical literature, but theists more generally, to think, a life couldn't be meaningful without God. And I think one one thing this argument nicely does is kind of push back against that idea, right? But I'm not sure. I'm sort of, I guess my official answer would be I'm kind of an agnostic about whether you could expand it. I definitely think the personal narrow scope is sound. I think it's a sound.
Right, and also there has been, empirical work on this issue. So there has been comparative work that tries to draw out the factor that people rely on them to recognize life as meaningful and, meaningless. And actually the research was was founded by a Templeton Foundation,
Okay.
where they go to different countries. They have this huge sample of believers and non-believers. And in each case, they are really similar to each other. There's family, there's freedom, or for example, they are really close to each other. So it just seems so puzzling to me that when it comes to the question of meaning in life, there's this huge value-laden, weighted judgment that in atheistic world it's just going to be, life is going to be meaningful.
Well, one interesting connection there is I've been reading a lot of David Benatar lately, and so he says, look, there's this thing called Pollyannism. People overestimate how well their lives are going. We're way too optimistic. Our lives actually suck. But one thing that's interesting, right, is that these judgments really cut across culture and religion. So it's not just that, atheists, for instance, think their lives are better than they are, or that religious people think their lives are. But Benatar's point is that almost everyone does this, right? So that's another kind of almost a negative reason for thinking that, meaning and value in these type of assessments really, when you start doing the empirical stuff, it turns out, they're sort of the same. They cut across religious beliefs.
Right. And also it seems to me that perhaps that's something that is worth looking at in future. Maybe I would do some work. I have to actually, work on a topic soon. So maybe it would be cool to kind of draw out empirically and ask people if, privacy could be that meaning, what would be adding to that meaning for them or not. I brought this up as a way to bridge the gap and to move to the privacy argument, because that's the argument that the first time, so I've heard this idea kind of, unsurprisingly, put in immature and, kind of uncooked or half-cooked, as you, might suppose, from some of the shoutings of the new atheists. I think they are, no question about it, they are philosophically shallow. But the idea lingered in my mind, and when I read the privacy argument as it appears in the book, I find it really convincing. So walk us through the privacy argument, and it also, is dependent on what privacy is. So give us a sense of that and then move us to the argument.
Yeah, so I think at the beginning of the chapter, part of the problem with this project is it's connected to so much else that it's got a bit overwhelming. But I tried to give at least a brief survey of here are some different views of privacy. One's about access control. Do you have control over who accesses personal information? And others focus more on kind of the content of what's accessible. But my basic point is that it doesn't really matter how you cash out privacy. Whatever philosophical account you want to take, want to develop your own, doesn't really matter. God violates your privacy. Now, maybe the word violated is loaded. So maybe the theist would say that's loaded. So that's fine. But even to rephrase it in a less loaded way, if God exists, you have no privacy, right? So if God's all-powerful and all-knowing, then necessarily God knows every fact. And I think these facts include where you are in space and time, and even your thoughts, and I think even more controversially, your own phenomenological experience of the world, because I don't think, knowledge consists in solely just being able to write out all the true propositions, right? I think there's experiential knowledge too, and that would be knowledge God would have to have. And I argue that, at least when it comes to privacy, our lives are worse, and that, this could establish, if not wide anti-theism for every person, right? There's a distinction here I make. It could establish wide or overall anti-theism, at least for certain persons, if they think that privacy is really essential to the meaning of their life. And the reason I make this move is because I think a meaningful life is one of the most important goods, right? So I think that it overrides these other considerations. Someone might say, but God's existence has all of these other good things. And I think those considerations are usually right. It's true. There are lots of great things that come with God's existence. But at least for certain individuals, their life is going to lose meaning. And that's pretty awful. I just ask the question. You could be, really wealthy, have all sorts of different material goods, maybe intellectual goods, but would you choose that knowing it was a meaningless life if you could have a meaningful life, right? I think the answer, no matter how you set it up, is you're always going to choose a meaningful life.
Yeah, I'm sympathetic to that. You also bring about, an idea from Linda Zagzebski, which is intersubjectivity. Omnisubjectivity. And I just don't think, even you could run the argument even without that. And also, another thing, okay, I will keep the latter one, but for now, what I want to say is, why care about privacy? What makes it valuable?
Yeah, so, I try to generate at least some sympathy to this through a series of intuitions, but I'll just jump to sort of the more extreme voyeurism example. So, suppose there's a voyeur who's many light years away, right? And suppose this voyeur is a perfect voyeur in the sense that they're never going to get caught. You're never going to have any causal interaction with them, any type of physical interaction. You're never going to be aware of them. But suppose this voyeur is watching you in your house where you live, while you're in the bathroom. Maybe they're taking photos of you while you're changing. And the voyeur's getting gratification from this, right? It doesn't have to be sexual gratification, but they're getting some benefit from this. Well, on the one hand, you might say, well, isn't this a better world than it would be otherwise because they're getting this gratification and the person being spied on is in some sense not being harmed, right? They're not even aware this is happening, and they're never going to be aware in this example. No one's ever going to be aware. Well, I want to say that, look, that's actually a bad state of affairs. That person's privacy has been violated. They have a reasonable expectation of privacy in certain cases that they would have to be aware of and consent to being broken. So part of what I'm trying to do in that example is say, look, even if God's intentions for you are purely good, right? They're purely benevolent. It's sort of beside the point, right? It's the mere fact that your privacy is being violated without you having any say in the matter. That's negative here, right? And you can change the example. You could make the voyeur benevolent, right? You could make the voyeur benevolent, and I think we're still going to say they're doing something wrong, right? Maybe the voyeur is using you somehow without you knowing to cure cancer, right? That's a pretty good thing. So my point there is to sort of emphasize it doesn't matter what's done with this information about you. It's still negative. And so we were talking about before the episode started, but I don't really think to date anyone's kind of tackled what I say in this chapter. So I hope eventually someone does.
One thing which is really, I think, significant about this argument is the value of free will and the ability, to exercise your free will when it comes to that. Because given a theistic view, Islamic or otherwise, the presence of free will is one of the greatest goods. And so in this scenario, people or individuals have been deprived of any sort of consent. So that actually plays, I think, a significant amount of role, especially in the sense that, for example, Laura Ekstrom's book is out, and she goes through different models of free will and trying to explore whether free will is worth it really, given the fact that you have it or not. And when I was reading that section of her book, I was like, this is actually really relevant to the idea of the privacy argument, because free will is really that much valuable to the theist. And another point I wanted to... Go ahead.
So is the question whether privacy, this type of privacy violation, takes away free will? That's to be clear.
Yeah, I think the greater good of free will should be somehow figured into this.
Okay. So some of that will be connected to your view of God's foreknowledge, right? So whether open theism or Molinism is true. So I'm not sure, but there's probably something worth exploring there. I didn't want to get into divine foreknowledge because it was just going to take me too far afield, but I think your view of divine foreknowledge is going to matter there with respect to freedom and maybe even there's a type of modal privacy, right? So if Molinism is true, you don't have modal privacy from God, which is something I just thought of, but maybe an interesting connection.
Right. I think I think there must be more exploration of this idea. So another thing which I got when I put this argument forward, and you mentioned this response in the book, is that maybe privacy is just not in itself a real good. Maybe it's just a derived value. But then I'm like, okay, even if it's a derived value, then those values from which privacy has been derived will be, the driving force behind the argument. So what's the problem here?
Yeah, and I don't think it's unreasonable to say people can find meaning in their lives from a derived value, right? I don't, and you want to explain why that derived value is valuable, then you can fall back on the other values. So maybe the right to privacy is really something about the right to be left alone or the right to autonomy, right? Well, then you just cash out what you're saying about privacy in those terms. So I agree with you. And that's part of the reason I didn't spend too much time on that, is I don't find that compelling. Someone would have to give me a good reason for thinking why derived values can't contribute to a meaningful life or something like that, which I don't see.
I feel some sense of tension going on. So, and the tension here is this. Suppose that the theist would concede, okay, that, okay, the privacy is valuable, it's not a derived value or something. But then I feel a tension. So, for privacy, if privacy were to be considered valuable, then I think it could play a significant role in response to the divine hiddenness argument. But one thing I think that keeps it, or at least limits its role as a response to the argument from hiddenness, is the fact between experiencing a good and obtaining a good. So having some sort of allowing for a space for consent, or involving the individuals in that privacy part, is the obtaining of it that the anti-theist is really targeting, not the experience of privacy.
And I think that's why the voyeur example is so powerful, right? Because in the voyeur example, the person who's being spied on does in fact have the experience of privacy, right? They aren't aware that they're being spied on, and yet they don't have privacy. So there is this distinction. And in other places I've said, look, yes, there is some value to experiencing something, even if that thing or that good doesn't actually obtain. But there is this distinction. Why? Well, the voyeur example, I think, shows us there's this distinction, right? It's a worse state of affairs that person is being spied on, even though they aren't aware of it. It's a worse state of affairs than otherwise, or all else being equal. So, I do think there's a distinction there, and I don't think it commits me to saying that experience has no value at all, right? I think that's right.
Right, and maybe one last point, the idea of experiencing versus obtaining is the idea that, okay, maybe for now I will factor it out, maybe we will come back to it, but one thing which you invoke numerous times through different arguments that you provide is the all else, being equal condition. So let's say, okay, give me your thoughts about that. What if all things are not equal, or someone alleges that all things are not equal?
Yeah, I mean, I might need something more specific, but I think some of what I'm doing, all else being equal, is trying to hold the other things fixed in the world I'm comparing. So, if we're taking the voyeur example, right, I'm just assuming that the two epistemically possible worlds are otherwise identical. Because if it turned out that, so in in the world where the woman is being spied on, that, I don't know, all her kids die in a horrific accident or something, then clearly it's better for her to be in the world where she's being spied on. So not all else is equal in that case. So I'm just trying to hold fixed the other variables.
What I'm trying to get at is this, basically. So let's quickly go back to the axiological considerations as it is relevant to Pascal's wager. So, for example, take Liz Jackson's formulation of the idea of Pascal's wager, of the argument. Then, in her mind, for Liz, acting out on the fact that this infinite good would be behind the option. When you want to weigh your decision of the option that God exists, like the infinite, of the infinity of the afterlife, for example. What I meant to say was that I think these considerations, when they are offered, they cannot be always the symmetry breaker between the axiology of the atheist and the theist. And the reason this is so is first of all, there are more versions of naturalism. Now, this isn't the version that I'm sympathetic to, but there are views, I just forgot the name of the philosopher, that build on cases of post-mortem survival as a digital afterlife, for example.
Yeah, Steinhardt?
Right, Steinhardt.
Yeah.
So that would be, one way to keep that infinite good, even on a naturalistic worldview.
Yeah.
The thing is that maybe the infinite afterlife is not something that should be considered, the axiological good for the anti-theist. So, and another thing is, when I was looking at that considerations that somehow the axiology of theism outweighs any good you might have in that case, that gives me pause. So in that case, what do you think with regard to the Pascal's wager and how axiology could break, the asymmetry?
Yeah, I'm aware of Liz's work. I haven't thought about it too much. I think there are two things at play, right? There are two questions. There's the question of, is this good the theist or naturalist is pointing to doesn't really exist in the other world. So I think when the theist appeals to an infinitely good afterlife and heaven, they're appealing to something they don't think that is in a naturalist world. So there's one question there, right? Well, is that really the case? Or could we get this type of good in a naturalistic world? And I think, you can definitely get those sorts of worlds in atheist worlds. And I think maybe, like you say, maybe in naturalist worlds, we can. I'm maybe a bit more skeptical of that. So that's one question we can ask. And then I think, but the second question, though, is the good that the theist is pointing to really, in fact, a good, right? And so I think there's this assumption that an afterlife would be good. An infinite afterlife would be good. I actually think that's I lean in the direction of thinking it's a good, but I do think it's more of an open question than people really imagine. So there's this whole literature on the philosophy of boredom. Would an infinite life be bored? And I was just talking to Thaddeus Metz the other day, and he was sort of saying there's a different worry about repetitiveness that's distinct from boredom, and people really haven't taken that seriously. So I think there are two questions. Can we get this in an atheist world or in a theist world? And is what we're talking about actually, in fact, a good thing?
And I think I share your intuition with regard to the fact that, it's more of an open question that people would suppose it needs more exploration. But also the field, that a specific part of the field, the axiology, is quite young. So it's reasonable to have different credences, with regard to different aspects of it.
Right.
Okay. One thing which is kind of surprising is the view of pessimism and optimism that is building. Some people have extended that. So previously, before the start of the episode, we talked about, Eugene Nagasawa and the existential, the systematic problem of evil, and how pessimism, is fine on an atheistic view, but the atheist who wants to be existentially optimistic has some sort of challenges. So when it comes to the axiology, what are your thoughts on that idea?
Yeah, I think it's something that deserves more attention. I hadn't read Eugene's paper, I think, when I was writing this book. I think before I said I'm inclined to think we can just give up optimism, or the naturalist can just give up optimism much easier than the theist can give up the existence of God. Although, in the context of the axiology of theism, I guess the line is going to be, but isn't that a bad-making feature of naturalism, that you have to give up optimism? And I think, that's that's probably true, but I haven't really thought about it enough to know whether there are ways out.
Right. So I was actually thinking about the fact that primarily in the literature, pessimism is characterized by their suspicion and their skepticism of progress, real, genuine progress. But that's, something that naturalists recognize, like the existence of progress, moral progress. There are arguments from the success of the sciences in favor of the naturalist. A naturalist, even within the wider circles of the social sciences, like take Steven Pinker, for example, argue that our lives are getting better and better, violence is declining. So moral progress is also affirmed by the atheists. So I think the fact that somehow the atheist has no other choice. I understand the intuition is strong behind it. And theists are not the first person to say it. There are atheists who, are pessimists, and they share this intuition, or even optimists. But I think it just needs more exploration when we're considering the existential optimism or pessimism. Having said that, let's go back to the arguments. Another argument you give is the autonomy and dignity argument. So how is that different from the privacy argument?
Yeah, so a lot of times in the literature, autonomy was kind of thrown out as a reason in support of anti-theism. So we're not really free, or God somehow restricts us. And I kind of say, theists typically assume libertarian free will. They're very closely connected. Theistic belief and belief in free will. And it's just not clear to me how one's autonomy is violated if God exists, on the assumption that we have libertarian free will, which is a fair assumption, I think, given what many theists say. So I basically say it's just, autonomy I don't think is a very good reason, at least as it's been gestured at in the literature, in favor of anti-theism. But I do think there's a sense in which theism might harm our dignity. So there's this principle that says, if you're created for anyone else's purposes, it's a dignity harm, or your dignity has been harmed. And you can think of this when parents have children for specific reasons, right? They really push their kids to be a professional athlete, or they want more help on the farm. You think there's something wrong with this. And so one thing I say is that, if God exists, there's some sense in which you're necessarily created for God's purposes. Right? God has an overarching plan for the world. God's the first cause of the world. It's kind of a divine plan in place. I know some of this is going to depend on what stripe of theism one accepts. And I think this is a downside. I realize there's a whole literature on dignity, right? So I recognize I'm very quick there, but it was sort of another place where I thought I can't get bogged down too much on competing conceptions of dignity. But I do think there's something there worth exploring.
Right, and to be fair, at the outset of the book, you kind of point out that this is actually more of an invitation to explore. So these are just, going to be further explored. Now, and what's interesting to me is that how the dignity considerations axiologically also play a role in the problem of evil. So, for example, previously I had Phil on and we talked about animal suffering and how if animals, given the fact that they are deprived of the libertarian sense of free will and they are just, in service to humans, being used in and considering especially the problematic nature sometimes more so than other times of our interactions with animals. how would that dignity, with regard to animals, would we figure into our observations? So one thing which I think one should appreciate from the axiological considerations is that it's closely connected to the problem of evil to divine hiddenness. So I do really feel that some sort of connection was missing, and axiology is really filling that gap. And another thing is that along with the meaning of life philosophy, as Metz, for example, works on it. And by the way, for those who are listening, my translation of Metz is done. It's online. You can download it. You can also go to Field of Papers and just download it from Metz page. So that's just for the listeners. But another thing is that one of the good things about axiology is that it also allows bringing us concepts from continental philosophy, which I'm not big on, but, to kind of get it here and explore it a bit more. So I think for these two reasons specifically, the project of axiology is really interesting to me. So that's the dignity arguments. Do you think then that would work for white personal anti-theism?
I know I've said this once already, but I'm kind of a bit of an agnostic on that too. I think the privacy argument is the strongest to developing a wide version of anti-theism. I'm not sure. I think one way to go about this would be to spend a lot more time on different concepts of dignity and show maybe how theists might hurt them. So if you could show that for every major conception of dignity, then I think you would start generating an argument in that direction.
Yeah, that could do the heavy lifting. So I think we've sufficiently covered the dignity argument. One other thing which is quite interesting for me, given its implication for divine hiddenness, is the sacrifice and complete understanding argument. Again, this is another argument which, like the privacy argument, seems to me to be influential. So I love this argument. Take us through the argument and the idea behind it.
Yeah, so everyone that I've pitched the sacrifice argument to says it's out to lunch, so they can't see it. So I don't know. I included it anyway. I think it's interesting. So one, the basic idea is that, look, if you have to, there's some basic assumptions here. So the first is that if naturalism is true, there's no afterlife. And the second is that if theism is true, there's an afterlife. I think I say eternal in the book, but it really could only just be life extension, right? It doesn't have to be eternal. And I say, look, the most powerful kind of sacrifice, or the biggest sacrifice one could make, giving up one's life, even lesser sacrifices, giving up one's time or money, those aren't really sacrifices on theism in the same way they are on naturalism. On theism, if we're assuming one goes to heaven, I know there are complicating factors here if you think there's a hell, but let's just suppose one goes to heaven. You really are compensated for those sacrifices, right? And so part of what I say is it's hard to understand how something is a sacrifice if you don't actually give something up, right? If you are compensated, it's not to say that what you did isn't good. It's just to say a naturalist seems like they're giving up something a lot more, right? They're not going to be compensated for their time or money in an afterlife, and not going to be compensated for giving up their life. Say you jump in front of a bus to push someone out of the way when you're in your 20s, right? There's a whole life. I mean, even right now, there are healthcare workers who are risking their lives with COVID, right? If naturalism is true, they won't be compensated. And so I don't know how strong a consideration I really think this is, but I think it's at least one sense in which this good of really what I call genuine, but just a powerful sacrifice isn't possible on theism, right? In some Christian traditions, your reward is in heaven, right? That's kind of what you're working towards, you're looking forward to. And that's not to say that's not a good. It's just to say this good of sacrifice is missing.
Just to appreciate the fact that the force of this argument, I have to say that it's really surprising to me that this is, not taken more seriously. The reason I say it is this.
No one thinks this is good.
So there is theistic literature behind it. So just let me generally point out what it is. So Schellenberg, one of the primary objections, initially one of the objections he considered was the fact that one of the goods of divine hiddenness, for example, one of the greater goods is the fact that God allows atheists to undergo self-sacrifice and in a noble moral way without any expectations of or gift. So that's a real theistic response, and I think it also figures into our considerations. Now that's for the theistic side, which I think has more room to be explored. Another thing is that on the naturalistic side, there has also been similar views. So, for example, take Graham Hoppe. In the anthology, there is a part that Graham Hoppe says, were theism to be true, if theism was true, it would be the fact that maybe appearance and reality would be different. So maybe that could go back to complete understanding arguments, So I think there's just more room to explore. So some of these, I think, is maybe due to the fact that this part, the axiological literature has not yet been, exposed to different people. And I think it's interesting to get more people involved in it, because there are just a vast number of issues that are involved.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting point about Schellenberg. I mean, I think that would have bolstered what I'm saying. I just I missed that, but that's interesting. Right? So if a theist is making that kind of response, then they're kind of in some sense conceding the point I'm making, right? So
right, and the thing is, take the idea of cognitive closure and the afterlife. Okay, supposedly, the fact that there is cognitive closure, as the skeptical theist, for example, says, that we do not have access to all the right reasons and the no-seeing inference and so on. The fact that we, maybe when we go to heaven, for example, Liz Jackson says that, or other theists typically say, maybe we get to a more full understanding of God, of the divine reality. So the fact that this understanding, that this level of increase in our understanding is valuable, I think could play the same role for the anti-theist. That, the fact that I desire more understanding is plainly the flip side of the theist desiring more understanding of divine reality.
Yeah, I think it's hard to deny that understanding, kind of gaining that kind of understanding is a good, right? I think there's, it's just kind of, it falls out of the concept of God, right? There's, if God exists, then you and I can't know what it's like to be God. I think Hoppe makes a point that the universe then is in some sense mysterious, right? There's a mysterious aspect to the universe. And if you value understanding, then that's a sense in which the universe is worse. Again, it's not to say it's overall worse, but at least when it comes to understanding. Now people have countered this, that, well, but there's another object you can understand something about, and that's God, right? So I think the gap is larger, though. There's going to be more you can't understand, but people have mentioned
Also, it's nice to see that, again, the interdisciplinary or the connections that axiology builds. So one of the features of a good basis or foundation for meaning of life that Metz points out is the fact that, understanding or having the progress built in your narrative of a meaningful life is also really important. He actually, pays a lot of attention to this from both, the theistic side and the atheistic side. So I think that also is worth considering more. Another reason I think it should be taken more seriously is because I think both parties kind of rely on understanding, and it's just obvious that they look at it as a good. So again, naturalist, progress of science, moral goods, these improvements, the fact that as more we understand, it seems to be, for example, if you're an optimist, that's not always the case.
Right.
Reduction of violence and suffering for us, even, if it's relatively, in comparison with what we have, not that great, but still. So it seems to me that there's much more to be explored here. And, there's the question of just what is complete understanding, that also plays a role. So having gone through these, do you think that atheistic words are necessarily the best in that we could obtain the most goods in atheistic words that would not be open in a theistic words? This is a big question. So
yeah, I think there's an important distinction to make, right, between naturalism and atheism, right? So atheists could be supernaturalists who just think there's no monotheistic God, but there's still a supernaturalistic. So one thing I'm kind of doing there is exploring this idea that, maybe in an atheistic world that, albeit is supernatural, you can get lots of the theistic goods without having the downsides that usually go with it, the advantages. So, I've sort of come to think maybe I was too strong in that chapter, but I think, so there's sort of two questions. One, could you get these goods by luck, right? Could a world just happen to turn out like this? Maybe cosmic justice, maybe the world is just a just place through luck. And then the other question is, could you get some of these theistic goods through some kind of impersonal mechanism, right? Maybe karma is true and kind of ensures some sort of cosmic justice, and it's just this impersonal mechanism, right? And so I think answering those questions are really going to tell us. Of course, some theists of certain stripes are going to say, well, look, a personal relationship with God is the most important good, and maybe I can get cosmic justice through an impersonal mechanism, but I can't get a personal relationship, and that's a really great good. So I do think it's an open question, but I think one thing I wanted to sort of do in that chapter is say, look, there is this distinction between naturalism and atheism, and look, it could very well matter for our axiological assessment. So I hope I at least kind of drew that distinction.
You mentioned something. So going back to the privacy argument, you mentioned the value of having a personal relationship. So it seems to me that having a relationship, if you want to have a real, genuine relationship, there's some sort of give and take involved. So again, with regard to the privacy argument, it's a peculiar situation that there is no consent or the exercise of free will in this relationship when it comes to privacy. If that is such a good to have this relation, and free will figures into that, it just seems peculiar to me that, I don't know, it doesn't add up into my mind. So that's why I like the idea. So Anyway, one other thing which really surprised me was when I was reading the anthology and it comes down to Graham Oppy. It really surprised me that Graham Oppy is not on the neutral side. The reason I mention this is because in different books like arguing about gods or the Cambridge element that Graham Oppy has written. So, but again, for those who are listening, the Persian translation of Graham Oppy's Atheism is available online. So, maybe you could download it and read it up. It's a fantastic piece of work. But going back to the point is that he says, it's just, either way, I really don't care. And he builds it, into the initial worry that you brought about for the theist. So, just quoting him is this: if naturalism is necessary, then it is impossible that there is anything divine. If it makes no sense to have desires about impossibilia, then there are no interesting questions about the attitudes that we ought to take toward divine things. And this really surprised me about the fact that why isn't he after that, why doesn't he state that we should remain neutral? In fact, he says maybe there should be another category to this. So previously when we talked, you said your latest, solution or your preferred solution to the initial challenges that you were facing with the, the question of God's necessity is to argue for epistemic possibility. And you said Oppy was not aware of that, so...
I don't know if he wasn't aware of that. I'm sure he's aware. I just...
Means that you haven't, put this as a possibility back then so that he would be aware of it with regard to axiology.
Yeah, I tend to think he still would have thought of it. I just, yeah, I'm not sure why the axiology of theism, why this debate has been, some have been insistent on having it in these metaphysical terms when you don't have to. So on his view, so he endorses the Louis Stalnaker semantics, coupled with his view that naturalism is necessarily true, so true in every possible world. It makes sense that he would say that, right? It makes perfect sense. You're wishing for something that's impossible. You're asking me to compare something that's possible, but I do think, yeah, the epistemic solution is a nice way around it. I haven't asked him about what he thinks of that solution, but to me it seems like
it doesn't seem to me like all worries are metaphysical. So there have been, with regard to the methodology of axiology and its exploration, other moral, religious concerns. So one would be, as you mentioned in the book, Dustin Cromet's worry, and which really surprised me. Now, at the outset, I have to say that I'm a fan of Dustin's work, along with Joshua Rasmussen. I really like his work. But it really surprised me. Now, to be fair, he was offering those remarks as a way to invite others to engage with those questions, but also offered his own opinion too. So what do you think about the view that Dustin takes?
Yeah, so I hope I'm not too harsh on him in the book. I guess one thing in philosophy, I don't think there are any holy cows, right? So I don't think there are any questions philosophers shouldn't ask. I don't think there are any stances philosophers shouldn't take. I don't agree with the kind of cancel culture we've developed. And not that this is that, but that's kind of what's informed. That's kind of my background presuppositions. And so it surprised me too, I guess, that he would say these things. But one thing I was thinking too, why would this apply to the axiology of theism and not the problem of evil, say, where you're really in sometimes graphic details trying to explain, how someone could be raped or how someone could be bludgeoned to death, and you're trying to offer reasons why God would permit that to happen. That seems to me just as controversial, or from a theist perspective, just as kind of challenging God maybe, or I guess I'm saying I'm just not sure why the axiology of theism is any different than the problem of evil or even divine hiddenness.
Right, but then this takes us back again to that section of your book, and you mentioned the fact that you have criticized some views on philosophy of religion as maybe, being too infused, or rather too infused with biases and, religious takes. And specifically, it's your paper that you critique Nick Trakakis' view. So that is square with what you're saying right now. Do you feel that there is a tension here?
I think my point about the Trakakis paper was, so he was sort of saying philosophy of religion is, too infused with people's religious beliefs. And my point, my basic point was that even if that's true, it doesn't matter. You still have to interact with what they're actually arguing, right? Even if biases are playing a huge role. So I don't think that's necessarily inconsistent with what I'm saying. I mean, if someone's religious biases prevent them from altogether working on the axiology of theism,
then so be it.
Then so be it. But on the other hand, if someone's religious biases you suspect are making them inclined towards a certain position, right, in the axiology of theism, I think my reply is the same as what I say to that Trakakis paper. Even if that's true, if they're giving arguments, then you still have to address those arguments, right? We can psychologize about people's motivations all we want. I mean, I think have them, but we have to look at what's kind of on the paper and what people are saying. And
right. So, okay, there are two things I want to mention here. One thing is the view is actually really complex. So there is a book that I just forgot the title of the book, as I did before we talked, surprisingly, is the book that is 4 Views on Philosophy and God. And there are different views that people take towards this. So I think, the position that also Kirk or Dustin express is not really controversial. So there are people who would say that it's philosophy that trumps, for example, religious considerations. They are complementary or not. Basically, you could, view this as a reason or faith. That's far too much of a stretch. But, that sort of debate. But one thing which I think is relevant here is the flip side of methodology, right? So I think one view would be that maybe methodologically speaking, if we want to allow these feelings, for example, or these religious takes into our philosophical considerations as analytic philosophy so dispassionately likes to do so, wouldn't that doesn't seem to me to be, sitting well with that approach. But to be fair, atheists then could do the same. Like atheists could, bring their takes, their emotional takes, or, their intuitions or their prior commitments to the surface too, or to their works too. So I do not think that's that much of a big worry.
Yeah, and I think it's also, it's unfair to impugn religious believers as if we're the only ones that have these kind of underlying intentions and biases. I think everyone comes to what they're doing with presuppositions. Analytic philosophers, we like to think we're kind of dispassionate and aloof from all of these kind of personal considerations, but I don't think that's how people actually are, right? So I think, it's one thing to say, well, your argument is false because I'm a theist, so I know it's false. Or your argument is false because I'm a naturalist, so I know it's false. So that's one kind of maybe pernicious way your bias is. But if people are giving arguments and interacting with arguments in good faith, I think you just have to take them at that.
Yeah, I think so too. And, pick your favorite position, pick the position that you're committed to, and maybe you have a high confidence in. You can immediately look up the literature. You can see people 10 harder than you occupying, the disagreeing parties. So that's not really, it's actually an important reason to not psychologize, But anyway, so having said all of this, what do you hope would happen or should happen next for axiology?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I just want more people to start working on it because, my imagination is limited, and even just talking in this interview, I've gotten, you've mentioned ideas and pathways that I haven't thought of for different paper topics, and I think, I think more people working on it. I also think I'd like to see more non-Western approaches, particularly with respect to ethical theories and how they might impact this debate, and also just non-Western worldviews, right? The axiology of non-Western worldviews. So what's the axiology of Jainism or Buddhism, right? I think it's we sometimes get criticized, Western philosophers of religion, for not including these worldviews, but on the other hand, it's impossible to be an expert in all of them, right? So I think in some sense it would just be more ideal if other people joined the conversation. So yeah, I know that's not too specific, but I just hope more people work on it.
Another fact is that some people are involved in other fields with axiology. They are doing axiological work. They are not aware of this recent development. So just to give two examples off the top of my mind. One was a paper, I just forgot the title, but the main idea behind it is that maybe it would be good, a moral good, to let patients be involved in the label they received during medical procedures. So another one which I explored more is the ideas that John Dehner has worked on, or Nick Bostrom and others in information and technology have worked on. So, for example, one thing which has been explored and is being explored is the idea that if technological advancements take place and there's significant amount of speed for them, it would mean that perhaps work would disappear. Now, does this mean that would be a good thing? Should we want that to happen or not? So, for example, John Dehner has a book comprehensively discussing, putting forward reasons why this would be a good thing. Because, so this really seems to me to be an area that not only it remains rather disconnected from each other, these fields, and they could use each other coming together. But it actually seems to me to be a really promising ground for developing further considerations.
I think the other thing I would mention too, there are just a lot of ethicists who aren't aware of this field. But I think oftentimes I'm writing on this and I think, well, I'm sort of doing philosophy of religion, but I'm sort of doing ethics now, and I think there would be a lot to gain from sort of, hardcore meta-ethicists getting involved in this debate too.
Right. So just as one example, take Shelley Keegan's and, the debate, or just more basic than that, take the debate on this desert, and how that plays out with axiological considerations. But anyway, it's a fantastic field to explore, and I think I will continue exploring it. So at the end, is there anything that you want to mention, any new projects you're working on that you want to share?
Well, first, thanks for having me. And I would mention my book, Ubuntu and Western Monotheism, an Axiological Investigation, has just been accepted by Routledge. So hopefully in the fall, it will be out in print. My next projects, I'm kind of shifting gears to work a little bit on antinatalism, but there are connections between that and the axiology of theism too. So we'll see what comes of it.
Right, and I'm sure Dave would be interesting to read and explore too. So remember, you've heard the updates first here.